Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
So, it's a very great pleasure and honour to have a chance to talk to you, Ruth, about your life, which is entangled with mine in various moments. I will start by asking you when and where you were born.
Oh, good question always. Well, I was born in Derry, or Londonderry, often called Stroke City, Derry, Londonderry, in Northern Ireland, 1933. And my parents were both from Ulster, father from Belfast, mother from Derry.
Seems, sorry, go on.
And actually, well, maybe anticipating the Stroke City bit of it, it's quite important because in my life and many people's lives growing up in Ulster, because Derry was often thought to be the Catholic name, Londonderry the Protestant name, which is totally an oversimplification, but that's how it was presented. And growing up in Northern Ireland, it was very hard to avoid that polarization of Catholic versus Protestant. My parents were really liberal and did a huge amount to fight that politically, educationally. But it's funny, looking back, that I still grew up thinking the world was divided into two lots, Catholics and Protestants, and two different views of the world.
You say they were very liberal, but were they liberal Protestants or liberal Catholics?
Well, good question. They were both Protestants, but my mother particularly regarded herself as a nationalist Protestant, which was kind of across what you would normally expect, because nationalists, in other words, Ireland as Ireland, would normally be associated at that time with the Catholics. But they did a great deal in the 30s in trying to form a Labour Party which was non-sectarian. They saw the ship workers in the docks without any preventive clothing or health and safety regulations, and managed to unite them or helped them to be united into a Labour Party that went across Catholic and Protestant. And I remember that as a small child, these, to me, big rough men coming to the house. But my father did a great deal university-wise, because this was after the war, became president of the local college, Magee College, which had begun as a Presbyterian, training Presbyterian ministers, very Protestant. And he helped it to turn into a university college with the aspiration of being non-sectarian, with huge opposition, of course, from the Ulster Unionists and the real Protestant diehards. And it then became open to Catholics too. They didn't come as much as you might have hoped, but he really forged across Catholic and Protestant relations.
So he was an academic, really?
He was an academic. He was professor of classics there.
That's interesting. And what about your mother? Did she have an occupation as well as a role?
Yes and no. She had done a degree in English literature at Queen's Belfast, so she had a degree. And her family background was very much tied up with missionaries. And she had many role models herself of women training to be doctors and so on. Once she had got married and had children, she devoted herself very much to us. There were 5 of us. But then, as we started to grow up, she began doing a lot with the BBC, writing plays, and later teaching. So I always thought of her, well, very much as a mother, but also very much and increasingly as an intellectual.
Were you say there were 5 of you. What was the order of gender and age?
I was the first.
And sex and age.
Yes, well, whatever. I was the first, and I was a girl, obviously. And there was very much a feeling, even by my father, that kind of men came first. But because I was the oldest, I was like a boy. So it's a good question. Then there were 2 brothers, the 3 of us born before the war. Then during the war, we actually were over in Era, over the border, because the Navy took over our house in the college precincts to run the Battle of the Atlantic from, I'm told. And then there was a sister born near the end of the war and a brother after the war. So we stretched 13 years between us. And, you know, talking of extended families, we're still very close, all 5 of us, and the next generation as well. 3 of them, having travelled the world, went back to Northern Ireland, which is quite a pattern. 1 lives in Birmingham, commutes between France and Donegal and Birmingham. And I'm afraid I became rather English.
I'm sorry about that. On behalf of the Irish. Tell me something about the character of your mother and father and the way that may have shaped you a bit. I mean, you mentioned their political position, but were they warm, nice, loving, or the reverse, or what?
Well, my father was very much, I hadn't really thought about this, an Ulster man. Not hugely outgoing or touchy-feely, or on the face of it, maybe very loving in an outward way. Rather shy, I think. He actually died of a heart attack in his early 60s, and he was becoming more and more. He then moved to England. Touchy then. We always had very good relations, he and I remember particularly when, I said during the war we moved to Era, for a while to the sort of further reaches of Donegal in a small cottage, which has remained a very important image of family solidarity still there. But then to a great old Georgian house about 7 miles out of Derry, where he still worked in the college. And I went to school, and my 2 younger brothers went to school. And we used to cycle in those 7 miles during the war, often on a tandem with me at the back and my father at the front, and very, very hilly, so it took about an hour, and not modern bikes, of course. And he and I had so many wonderful conversations during those cycle rides, particularly on the tandem. And he also very much inspired me about classics. He had that wonderful dry Ulster wit with just a little throwaway remark, which I think very much affected my interest in language and the artistry of language later on, because it was something I didn't find so much in Oxford when I went there. My mother lived much longer, so in one way I feel more influenced by her, but not when I think back. She was a real character. She was always the one who had to tell the polite lies and entertain people, whereas my father would always tell the exact truth. She was a wonderful storyteller. She was hugely popular as a bit of a character among all her friends. Very outgoing. She loved people. She got on with people, though sometimes they would say, "Oh, Agnes." And she was very witty, very artistic, in a literary sense. Wrote a wonderful memoir about her life growing up, reaching for the fruit growing up in Ulster when she was quite elderly. The other thing I should have said about particularly my father, but both of them, was that during the war and leading up to it, my father was a pacifist. And in a way that didn't make so much difference in Northern Ireland because there wasn't conscription there during the war. But it did make a big difference to him. I mean, the police would come and raid the house and so on while we were in the college house leading up to the war. And for us as children, we really found that difficult because we would go along to school and everyone would be bringing their contributions for the war effort and we weren't allowed to. And we felt really rather pariahs at the same time, I think, even then, as being a bit proud about it. And that's very much influenced me, I think, that and my left wing in a fairly kind of non-doctrinaire way, background of seeing the good in everybody, not dismissing minorities. And I think that helped to feed into anthropology later. So I feel I was very influenced by them without being necessarily quite conscious of it all the time.
Very interesting. Tell me about your schools. Your first school perhaps made no particular impression, or did it?
Well, my schooling was interestingly complicated, and I probably need to talk about all of them. The very first school I went to was in Derry, the Londonderry High School, which, as you can guess, was a very Protestant school, because schools were segregated there, and there was no way I could have gone to another one, really. And that was just sort of kindergarten. I remember my first day. It's not very relevant, is it?
No, it's not.
But I do remember my first day when we all had to make something or other, and they distributed scissors to everyone to cut up. And I didn't get any scissors.
Oh.
And so what I did was I just tore it up. And I think back and I think, A, how feeble of me not to have gone and asked. But B, well, I did do something, didn't I? Even so. But I was only there for quite a short time, and then we went off to these far reaches of Donegal when I was about 7. And I went to the local little school, little church school, Ballymore School, where there were maybe 12 children in the sort of upper bit, and then some kindergarten children. And we sat in rows, desks, and we were all taught together. And I learned how to do parsing and mental arithmetic and writing and reading and a bit of Irish. And actually, I really, really look back at that school as where I started to know how to learn. It wasn't so much what I learned as how to learn. I mean, it really was a marvellous school. I mean, all wrong by all modern things. There was slapping, except they wouldn't have slapped a girl who was a daughter of a professor, which again was wrong. And we had to walk about 2 miles across the bog to get there. I remember getting stuck in the bog too. But that was actually wonderful. At that time I was learning to read and reading a huge amount at home. One of the first things I read, I think, was the old-fashioned translation of Homer's Odyssey, influenced by my father. And things about Cuchulainn, the Irish, the Celtic hero. And all that very much influenced me, fed into my later things. But then we came back to Derry after the war, and I went back to the Londonderry High School until I was 13. And I learned a great deal there. They were really good academically. I learned lots of French and Latin.
You have to be careful with tapping the table.
You're right. I learned, quite right.
It may reverberate through here.
Clap my hands instead. I learned lots of French and Latin and maths and so on. But my parents, back to Stoke City, felt very much that they wanted their children to have some of their education outside Northern Ireland, so they could see that there were other ways of doing things. And so I was sent away to a Quaker boarding school in York called the Mount.
Oh, the famous one.
Yeah, very famous one. And of course, Quaker made sense with pacifist background. And actually, one of my mother's sisters had become a member of the Society of Friends. And my parents made huge sacrifices financially. And also emotionally, I realized later, especially for my mother, to be without one of her children. She really, at that time, lived so much for her children. And I often wonder, was it worth it? Because academically, I think I would have got a better education, in a narrow academic sense, if I'd stayed at the school I was at. But on the other hand, I mean, to get all that atmosphere, I mean, though I never became a Quaker, I've always felt very influenced and sympathetic to that. And the music and the drama were really, really important. And again, they opened so many eyes and doors for me that were really important later in my life as well. So I can't regret going there. I just feel my parents made awful sacrifices. And then my two brothers went to Bootham, the companion school.
So you had your family here. But you must have suffered from the usual loneliness and deprivation at the beginning, didn't you? When you went to a boarding school away from your parents? Or do you not remember that?
Once I got there, I was very happy. Really from quite near the start, and made friends, including one friend I still have in Australia who I've just been corresponding with. But I was always miserable the day I left and in tears, and it must have been awful for my parents. I mean, even when I was really happy, I think later on in the sixth form, I just hated leaving home. And of course it was a big journey because you had to travel on the train from Derry to Belfast and then on the boat. And I was so often sick on the boat. That Irish Sea is awful. And then another journey the other side. So it was quite an undertaking. You didn't get there till the next day. And my poor parents, I used to be, in tears and not able to bear it going. But once I got there, they probably didn't believe it. I was really very happy.
Were you during that time, beginning to get particularly interested in any subjects? You mentioned the drama and the music and things like this, but academic subjects at all at school?
Well, what I went on to do at university was classics, Greek and Latin, and I was interested in those from near the start at school, influenced by my father, of course, but also by the things I'd read and thought were wonderful. I think the first year or so, it was just fun to learn all these different things, though even I thought the teaching was rotten compared to where I come from. Some of the people couldn't keep order, and that really, nobody liked that, even when they were making ructions themselves. But then as we came up to school certificate, because I was taking school certificate, I decided that I was allowed to do Greek, which was quite hard to do in 1 year. But it meant that was a real challenge to get that done. And having done that and got through it, then it seemed, hard to give up subjects. I knew I wanted to do Latin and Greek and ancient history. I wanted to go on doing French and English literature and maths. I really liked maths, and it was awful having to give that up. The other thing that actually was quite relevant looking back was that at that time you could do extras at your independent boarding school. And one of the extras that my parents arranged was for me to do elocution. And the school very much approved of that.
That explains your beautiful delivery, if I may say.
Well, but the reason the school very much encouraged it, Alan, was that I had this awful Ulster accent. And clearly, any girl who was going to be a product of their beautiful school should have a proper accent.
Of course.
So that was part of the whole agenda there, though I didn't realise it. But it did mean that I learned a lot of poetry and was encouraged to sort of not just be a shy little girl in delivery, which was my natural way, I think, but to speak out a bit more. And it therefore made me quite interested in that, which later on, I think, underlay, without my realising it, my interest in performance, oral performance, which has run through ever since my fieldwork.
Were there any teachers who particularly inspired you at that school? Do you remember? Sometimes there's someone who suddenly lights one up or turns one off.
Well, two in totally different ways. One was actually a teacher at the boys' school who on Sunday mornings, after the meeting for worship we all had to go to, ran a joint choir for members of both the Mount and Bootham. And that may sound a very trivial thing, but every single person I have met over the generations who attended that joint choir, were lucky enough to participate in that joint choir, has gone on to have an interest in music and in singing. He was just so inspiring. And I don't know why, but we all, whenever we meet, remember that.
Do you remember his name?
Yes, except that I've forgotten it for the moment.
Tell me later.
But I'll tell you later, yes. How I could have forgotten, I don't know, because it's deep in all our hearts. And I've always been interested in amateur choirs and singing, which again related to my work later on. The other person who inspired me, it was partly because she was such a bad teacher. She was the person who taught us Greek, and Miss Shepherd. And she did really well because she got us through in a year in school certificate. And she really did motivate and inspire us. But of course, the two of us who were doing it were very motivated anyway. We helped each other. But in the sixth form, she taught us ancient history. And the way she taught us ancient history for the syllabus was that she had written out long notes, and that by then there were three of us and another person had come. We would sit and we would write down these notes verbatim. I mean, what a way to teach. But what was so good about it, Alan, was that we began realizing sometimes these were wrong.
Wow.
She hadn't got it right. So we, all three, particularly me, but all three of us, got the habit of going and checking things up and looking it out for ourselves. And I think we learned more from that than, in one sense, from almost anything else in our sixth form studies, in a strange sort of way.
Fascinating. So, unless there are other things about the school we should know, should we move on to your applying for university somewhere, presumably several places, and ending up at Oxford, presumably?
Well, at that time, the Mount was really quite narrow academically, and if you like, gender-wise. The then headmistress thought there were just a few girls who might be destined for university. The rest, of course, would want to be nurses and teachers, and not to be encouraged.
This must have been during the war, or just after the war?
No, this was I went to the school 47, and I reached the sixth form for 51.
51, yeah.
And I've talked to people from the school since, and I hadn't realized thoroughly how downgraded most of them felt by her. But I was one of the select few who were clearly going to go to university. And the school didn't know much about these things, but I think may have been from my own background, my parents' backgrounds, or they may have heard of Oxford and Cambridge. But anyway, at that time, you could apply for both Oxford and Cambridge, and you stayed on for this autumn term to take the exams. And I and the two others who had done classics with me all stayed on, and we took these Oxford and Cambridge examinations. And then it was a matter of, did we get interviews or not? And I was lucky enough to get interviews at both places. My two colleagues, friends, didn't. Though one, I have to put this in, because she had family connections with Girton, was persuaded to switch to anthropology and archaeology as an easier subject. So she went and did that. And I'm really sorry I've lost touch with her, because I would love to know how she got on with it. But she actually had spent a long time reading The Golden Bough, sitting on the floor in the bottom of our very nice library. And she got really quite inspired by it, so it was fair enough. It also comes back to me that when we did Oxford entrance papers, one of the papers was the general paper. I guess that was the one I did well in, because I compared to all these other clever people who'd done Greek forever. I wasn't really very good technically at that point. And one of the things you had to do was a synopsis. And I do remember that the extract was from The Golden Bough. I can't remember what it said, but I remember that was the extract.
But which colleges were you offered or interviewed at then?
I was interviewed at Somerville and then at Newnham. And I think I was offered places at each. But I very much wanted Oxford because I liked, and had been advised also, that the idea of the 4 years and doing greats with the philosophy and ancient history as well would really be so interesting and so good. And also I very much liked Somerville and the interviews there, though they were tough. Whereas Newnham, it was so cold, and you walked down miles and miles and miles of corridors, and what's she called in Newnham, the principal?
Principal.
Yeah, and she was just very cold as well. Whereas the principal of Somerville, who was Dame Janet Vaughan, who was a wonderful person, was so interested and challenging and warm and interesting to talk to. So even if I hadn't been encouraged by my family and so on to prefer Oxford, I would have. But it was difficult because at that time there were very few places for women and lots for men. So for men, the thing was, if you did well, you got a scholarship. For women, if you did well, you got in. And I got in, and I thought that was wonderful. But my parents, my father particularly, was upset because he thought, how will I be able to afford it? So I got home full of excitement and thrill that I got in, to find that my father was rather upset about it. I mean, in fact, because I was from the north of Ireland, I couldn't get a state scholarship, as I would have done in England. But because I'd done very well in A-level, maybe it was called higher then, I got a state exhibition from Northern Ireland, and then they topped that up from local authority. And I got a loan from my school, which was wonderful, which they would have given me as a grant. But then the other things would have been taken away if it had been a grant, so they gave it to me as a loan. So people got loans then too, it's not just now.
And you finally did scrape in and go. And how was Oxford?
That was wonderful. That was wonderful. Having been at a...
Have a sip of water.
Yes. Having been at a girls' boarding school, which was pretty restrictive compared to the boys, to get to Oxford, and also all those wonderful people. But actually, this sounds terribly sort of goody-goody, but all the wonderful work that we had to do. I mean, to have 5 terms reading huge amounts, it really was huge amounts of Greek and Latin literature. It was just such a delight. I mean, I did work very hard, I must say. I did work very hard. And I had to, because there were all these men from Eton who'd done, or maybe been to the Dragon School or somewhere, and had done Greeks and written Latin verses since they were about 2. And I was supposed to be on equal terms with them. But I was, in the end. But I had to work very hard for it. Which made it all the more satisfying.
Were there any particular teachers who inspired you? Probably too many or a number, but either as lecturers or as your supervisor or at the undergraduate level?
Tutor, they called it in Oxford. My particular Mods tutor, Mods was the first part after the 5 terms, was a rather dry lady who I got on quite well with, but she did have downs on people. And she wasn't particularly inspiring, but she was very competent and thorough, and that was helpful. I do remember some wonderful lectures. One particularly, Eduard Frenkel, who was a most wonderful Germanic scholar with his German accent, and his totally rigorous philological expertise, which at the time was where the big stress was, rather than literary analysis. And he took us all through the cruxes in Aeschylus and the debates, and he'd done the great edition of it. And he took us through all the problems in Catullus. But then I remember it happened in a few lectures, not all. He might say, after all this rigorous Germanic nitpicking almost, he would say, but Catullus did write love poetry. This is a love poem. Listen. And he would then say it. Or he would sing, he would talk about the importance of the music of it and sing a bit out of the Sanctus and the B minor Mass. And to have the conjunction of those two things, I've never forgotten, and I think everyone who went to his lectures found them wonderful.
That's a very nice portrait. Are there any other portraits of lecturers? Or Sarah Green's father was a professor of Greek at Oxford, but perhaps a little later. I don't know if you came across a Green.
I don't remember, no.
I can't remember who the great classic scholars were when I was at Oxford a little later, but...
Well, there was a wonderful professor of Greek called E.R. Dodds.
Oh, yes.
Who
read his
talked...
work.
I mean, nowadays we would probably think rather wildly about mythology and so on. But that was very inspiring because it
Greeks
was a bit...
and the irrational and things like this.
That's right, and it was a bit outside the normal frame.
Yes. I liked his work.
I found the tutor I had in ancient history very inspiring. Somerville had a very good policy that, on the whole, not 100%, but on the whole, they provided tutors from their own fellows, and they didn't farm you out unless there was a particular reason for the particular expertise. Isabel Henderson, she was. Everybody thought she was so wonderful and clever. She published very little, which was a good way of keeping a high reputation. And she taught in a way that you might think was pretty unorthodox. I mean, I was usually in with somebody else, and we went along, we wrote our essays, and we read them out. One a week. Well, you were having to write 2 essays a week, which was such a good training, one ancient history, one philosophy. This was in the second part of the syllabus. So that was orthodox, reading that out. And then she would comment. So erudite she always was, and it was so inspiring hearing the things she just kind of threw in with a little smile. She didn't sort of sit down and say, now systematically this, this, this. But what she then did at the end was, next week, write, she didn't give us a title, she didn't give us a reading list, she would say, write something about that bit in Thucydides, or something around that debate. So again, you had to get pretty self-reliant about finding problems and issues, because if you just wrote something about what happened, she would say, that's a very nice narrative. So now let's get on to the important things. And she said fairly near the end, and I wished she said it at the beginning, but maybe we needed to find it out for ourselves. What you need to develop, Ruth, is a nose for problems. And I think that's really good. It's been really useful ever since. So in her unorthodox way, she was a great inspiration, and to many people too.
Lovely. Were there, apart from you worked very hard, but were there any other activities? Were you still singing and doing music and things like this?
I was still singing most of the time, not quite the whole time. I didn't manage to get into the prestige choir, the Bach choir. I make an excuse that I'd fainted for the very few times in my life that morning because I'd stood in a lecture on philology that was so crowded and hot that I was standing at the back that I fainted. So I pretend that's it, but actually I wasn't good enough. I hadn't had enough formal music training. At the moment, I enjoyed doing music, but I hadn't been trained in ear tests and things like that you needed. So I sang in smaller scale college choirs, and that was wonderful. There was one other thing I did a lot of, but just first, I always felt in one way a little bit of an outsider in Oxford, I came from Northern Ireland. I didn't feel an outsider as a woman because it was wonderful being at a women's college. It was assumed you could do everything better than the men if you came from Somerville, outside and inside work. But I was very aware that there was this kind of London clique, as I regarded it, who had all this kind of high culture that I didn't. And they'd been to St. Paul's and they knew all their Greek and Latin, they knew all the right people and they knew each other. So I felt a bit of an outsider. But at the same time, I felt I was doing just as well in the end as they were in my work. And also in my involvement in, I was quite involved on committee members and so on in a number of clubs. But the one that I came around to more and more was the Labour Club, which was big at that time in Oxford. It was different from the Socialist Club, which was the sort of far left, Stuart Hall, Ralph Samuel. But it was fairly mainstream. But it was great because every week they would have some wonderful speaker down from London or somewhere. I mean, Bevan, Attlee, and there was a sort of system by which you did it. And I met so many people there that I really found interesting, some of whom went on to into politics or journalism themselves, like Tony Howard, Anthony Howard, or Jeremy Isaacs. And in the end, I became the, what do they call it? Not the secretary, the activity secretary.
Or entertainment secretary.
Yeah, no, not entertainment activity.
That's what I did.
And then finally the chairman. And that was really interesting. And we had some big debates and some quite big, problematic issues. So I felt in one way I kind of made it, but mainly it was that I was interested in it and thought it was worth doing. And also a number of us within the Labour Club were very much members of or supporters of the movement for colonial freedom. And that was another thing that very much fired us. And I still have friends in Sri Lanka and so on that date back to then. So that was, I didn't then go on into politics, much to the despair of some of my colleagues from there, being so non-political, Ruth, you are useless. But some of the kind of, not Labour Party values, but left-wing liberal values have very much continued. Wouldn't vote Labour at the moment, though, or for many years, actually.
No, I share your feeling. How did you do in your finals? I mean, it's a two-part. You've got mods and grades, but...
Well, to what would have been my great surprise at the beginning, I got a first in mods, a reasonably good first in mods, and a first in grades, the second part. So I was lucky enough to get the third best first in grades that year. So Somerville was very pleased with me.
Excellent.
I was very pleased with myself.
I'm very impressed. But that then leaves you with a choice of what you're going to do next. So what did you think?
That was difficult. No, it wasn't difficult. I knew I did not want to stay at Oxford. I adored Oxford. I loved studying Greek and Latin and the classical civilizations and the philosophy that went with it too. But a number of my friends wanted to stay and do research, and I didn't know what research meant, and I had no idea how you would do research. But also I very much had this idea that I had been lucky enough to be at Oxford. Now it was time to go and contribute and do something in the real world. And I also had that loan, though that didn't hang over me too much. So I wanted to teach. But at that time, of course, well now too, to teach in a state school you had to do another year, and I didn't want to do another year. So I actually went and taught at an independent school, much to the horror of my Labour Party friends, for 2 years. Malvern Girls' College, which are very elitist. And I loved the teaching. I was shocked by some of the ethic, the moral, the values there, and the kind of pressurized stress on academics, and the children who didn't do well were absolutely down put and ostracized, even though it wasn't their fault. But having taught for 2 years, I felt, if I was going to teach seriously, I would have to go and get trained, do it properly. I think I did it reasonably successfully, but needed some training. But B, that maybe after all the intellectual life was for me, and that I wanted to go and do something else. And I explored various things, possibly to go and do Sanskrit at SOAS was one possibility. But I decided that was too big a commitment. I didn't quite know what that would involve. But I had this huge love of Greek and Latin civilization. What could be more wonderful? But I did have this little inkling there might be some other cultures somewhere else in the world. And especially with my movement for colonial freedom and background and so on. And so I thought, well, I would like to study something to do with Africa.
Just to explain that we've, British Academy being chock-a-block today has moved us from point A to point B, but it's the same Ruth Finnegan who is in a different light, and we're continuing with her decision to go to Africa. Okay, Ruth.
Well, as I say, I thought I wanted to do something about Africa. Didn't quite know how, but somehow, I can't remember how, discovered that maybe anthropology was the way to do it. So I went back, of course, to my own university where I knew I would have support and got scholarships and so on. I did the graduate diploma in anthropology under Evans Pritchard, EP, which was a great time to do it, actually. This was 59 to 60. No, 58 I did the diploma, the one-year graduate diploma, and then they always thought of the B.Lit as coming as a kind of second part of the diploma, and I did a very wild subject for that, but got experience of writing a thesis, and meantime realized that, of course, if I wanted to be an anthropologist, the only proper way to do it was to go do field work. So a slight gulp, but not a very big one, because everybody else was in the same boat.
But tell me about something, before you move on, about EP, because he was my examiner and great inspiration. What was he like as a teacher and human being, as you experienced him then?
Well, as you say, a great inspiration, but not an orthodox person. Oddly enough, his lectures were delivered in a very dry way, about the great figures in the past.
This is what became the history of anthropological
Exactly, taken partly from notes and so on. It was more, well, I'll say a bit more about him being a supervisor and a tutor later, but it was more that he was the kind of sacred king in the Institute. There were lots of Institute of Social Anthropology, as it then was. There were lots of warring factions within it, and he was the one thing that held them together. Later on, when I came back from my field work, if I can just anticipate, I got to know him more as a human being. At a time when he was going through very difficult experiences with the death of his wife and having to look after a young family. And I got to know him partly in himself, but partly through Godfrey Leonhardt, who was a great friend of his and was my main tutor in a lot of things. And I realized that he was a very shy person in a way, but he taught me loads. And you could see that there was a very warm human being there. And both he and Godfrey Leonhardt had the same reaction. They didn't teach you in any formal way. I remember my first tutorial with Godfrey Leonhardt. We went on for about 10 minutes and he said, "Oh, Ruth, let's go to the pub, Lamb and Flag." And I was very shocked in my puritanical little girl, Ulster way. But in fact, it was those sessions in the pub with him, and particularly with EP, where I began to become socialized, I think, into looking at things much more as an anthropologist and querying my own assumptions, of course, which included the fact that I was being taught by Catholic converts. And there they were so wise and intelligent and perceptive.
Did they try and... EP was sometimes accused of trying to proselytize, but did he try and convert you at all, or not?
Absolutely not.
No.
Not in any overt way. I mean, people might say that his great book, No Religion, was a kind of proselytizing, but not in any overt way at all, no.
So we'll come back to further exploration of his character later, but continue with you did your two sort of parts of the course.
Yes.
You did an M-Lit, presumably,
It
did
was
you?
B-Lit, it was called then.
Yeah. Which was on...
Well, I almost don't like to confess it. It was on ancient Irish kingship, kings. And I felt so ashamed of doing that because I didn't read early Irish. I mean, I learned a tiny little bit, but basically I didn't read it. And looking back, I now think how naive I was because I accepted this conventional wisdom at the time that ancient Irish society was unchanging for about 6 centuries. I mean, nowadays we would ask questions about that, wouldn't we? But it was an ancient society that was unchanging, and therefore you could use evidence from lots of different places. But the thing, I'm ashamed of it, but I'm still glad I did it, A, because of the skills of having to put together a long thesis, references, chapters, typing, and so on. But B, because one of the really interesting things was the role of the poets in early Irish society, if that's what you can call it, in praising the kings, but also using sanctions against them. And that then fitted in with a lot of my interests later on. So I'm glad I did it. And it was actually accepted by the professor of Celtic there, so it must have been not too terrible. But what I wanted to do was not pursue that. That was never an idea. That was just something you had to write the B-Lit from documentary evidence. I wanted to do fieldwork in West Africa, which ran counter to the East Africa expertise of most people at that time in the Institute. And I think the reason I wanted to go to West Africa was, it seemed to me to be more, as I saw it then, developed. They had towns, they had kings, they had tradition. Yes, exactly. They had all those things. And I just wanted to go and be involved in that.
And they didn't put up any obstacles to your...
Not at all. One of the wonderful things about EP, I should have maybe said this before, was he thought his pupils, his students, should do whatever they were good at. And it was one of the great things about it being a graduate diploma, that you get students coming in from a whole lot of different areas. And he wanted them to build on the disciplines that they learned from. And though he had a particular viewpoint, he actually was very liberal and didn't, some of his junior people perhaps weren't so much so, but he was very liberal and wanted people to do whatever they wanted to do and felt they'd be good at. And that was one of the great things about him. But of course there was the practical problem of where was I going to get a grant? And at that time the Colonial Social Science Research Council was one of the main sources. But of course they would only give grants for places which were still colonies. So that ruled out Ghana, and it was going to rule out Nigeria. So it was a matter of Sierra Leone or Gambia. And I wasn't thrilled by the idea of Gambia, which is just basically a river. So I wanted to go to Sierra Leone and got a lot of advice about it and so on. Almost the best bit of advice was, I think, from Godfrey Leonhardt, who said, look, Ruth, all right, choose a place that hasn't been, so to speak, studied by anthropologists in Sierra Leone. But for goodness sake, choose a tribe that you can pronounce, because you'll have to go to an interview. Good advice. So I chose these people called the Limber. That's very pronounceable, Limber. And I well remember the interview, because I had to go along, and there were all these amazing anthropologists, whose names I'd heard of, and they asked me hard questions. And I think it was Mayor Fortes who said, "So, Miss Finnegan, will you do a structural functional study of the Limber?" And I didn't quite know what that meant. But Lucy Mayer chipped in with some saving remark. No, I remembered it wrong, I'm sorry. He said, "What kind of theoretical framework will you use?" So I was a bit stymied. And then lovely Lucy Mayer stepped in and said, "I expect she will use a structural functional analysis, won't she?" Looking at me. So I said, yes.
How sweet.
So I got my grant.
You say the lovely Lucy Mayer. Was that just in this occasion she was lovely, or did you get to know her?
On that occasion, I've met her a few times, but I didn't really get to know her. But actually, they then took away half my grant, the Colonial Office, because Sierra Leone became independent halfway through. But fortunately, the Horniman Trust also gave me some, and so I had enough.
Do you remember that some anthropologists do and some repress it, the arrival moment in the field? Do you remember?
In the field?
Or arriving in Sierra Leone?
I remember arriving in Sierra Leone by boat. Those were the days. And then having to... Fortunately, I was staying with a good contact that I'd met in England at some point, who was at Fora Bay College, which was the university college there, who was very, very kind. I think I was an awful liability, but he was very kind. Harold Turner, who did a wonderful work on Aladura in West Africa from a theology point of view. They were so kind. But then I had to make contact with the Colonial Office people there, and I hadn't really been told who I needed to make contact with. I remember waiting around ages and ages, because they had to give me various clearances and help me to find a car and pay for or support various things. His arrival in the field, it was not a "I'm now in the field, I'm now not in the field."
Yeah.
It was much more gradual. I met some Limber people in Freetown, the capital town, including a Limber minister of the Limber Church, and heard him speak, giving sermons, which was wonderful. Then the first place I was in, Kamabai, was a village sort of on the main road up north that had a missionary station, American Wesleyan Missions. And I did spend several months there, but then went to a much more inner village where you had to walk to get to it. And I remember my arrival there more than anything else. But I was very naive and really broke so many of the rules that nowadays we would tell field workers.
You probably weren't trained in any way.
No.
Nothing, you just keep your gym shoes dry sort of advice, and that was about it, wasn't it?
Well, the only advice I got was make 2 copies of your notes and ship one out for when you lose the other lot. I think that was soon after Edmund Leach had lost all his
stuff. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I was told that, but really no training. Though I should have known better with some of the things I did. But like with all anthropologists, that first fieldwork experience was just seminal and
How long were you
crucial. Just over a year, not long, and that was all my grant extended to. And then I was back for a couple of months, a bit later on. So not long, and in one way I'm ashamed of that, but in another way I just learned so much while I was there, and really everything I've done since, in a sense, comes out of that.
What were you... Was it a narrowly circumscribed subject you were studying, or was it the old holistic total community study, or a mixture?
A mixture. What I was supposed to be doing by the Colonial Office, because you have to put up something they like, was the problems of people moving from the country to the town and why they do it. Nice kind of applied subject. But to do that, they accepted that you had to have some kind of holistic study first, because nobody knew about the limber. In other words, no anthropologist in Britain had done a study. Not the same thing, of course. So I was able to do, in a way, anything I wanted. And I was the more able to do anything I wanted because the Colonial Office had taken away half my grant. So the other half of the year after independence, which came halfway through my time there, I could concentrate on what more and more took my fancy and linked in with my classical literature studies. That was stories and storytelling. And that's what my doctorate was about. I did pay my dues. I wrote an ethnographic survey and something about why they did or didn't move to the towns, a bit speculative, for the Colonial Office, which they published, so they were happy enough with that. But then it was the stories and, very important, storytelling that I got so interested in.
It directly links back to all that you've said earlier about Irish literature and classical literature and everything. Were you using a tape recorder?
Yes, mostly. And that was not really so common at the time, because of course it was a tape recorder, it wasn't that portable. And the number of times I got the tiny little tape wound around the palm trees in my head, I wasn't a bit good with it, but it was batteries. And I had advice from a cousin who had worked on the linguistic survey of Gaelic in Scotland on what was the latest, best tape recorder. And that made all the difference, because though I did take down some stories from dictation, which was really what most anthropologists were doing at the time, I did take a lot tape recorded. But it was also, the big kind of road to Damascus moment for me, extended moment, was that I had begun as a good classical scholar thinking that literature and language lay in written texts, because that's what we studied. That was the reality of literature, a text. And so I had assumed, if I was studying the stories, that naturally what I needed to do was to capture these stories, dictation or however, transcribe them, translate them, both in a literal and in a nicer way, as I'd done for Greek and Latin. And then I would have the text that I was commenting on, and they'd be written out line by line, single-voiced, on a bit of paper. And that was kind of the reality of the story, because that was my whole background. And to be fair, it was a very common background set of assumptions at the time, sometimes still, that the reality of language and of literature, the thing that you can grasp, the thing that you can study, the thing that you can pin down and analyze, is written down on a page. Everything else is ephemeral and escapes. But of course, that wasn't why I had been so moved by some of these stories that were tragic and deep and commenting on human life, and humorous and satirical and wise and clever. All that had somehow vanished when I got these wonderful texts. I did put all these texts in my doctorate because that's what was expected. But I more and more came to realize that the important thing was, well, not the important thing, but one crucial thing, perhaps the definition, was the storytelling, not the text. It was the performance, which was multisensory and often multivocal.
How you say it, yes.
Yes.
Was there, you say it was a slow realization. It was during your field work, though.
It was from my field work, and it was reflecting afterwards on my field work. And I'm not sure how fully conscious I was at the time, except that I was making notes about aspects of performance and how the audience, but audience is a bit passive a word, how the other participants were taking part in it. And then when I came back to write up my doctorate, I began to realize that some of the American folklorists and anthropologists, linguistic anthropologists, were writing a bit about performance too, though not much was going on in Britain about it.
Who in America? Was this Dundas or?
Dundas, to some extent, was writing, though later on I found a lot of his stuff irrelevant to me, but he'd written a bit about storytelling. Delheims was very important, and then increasingly Richard Bauman at Indiana, and a whole set of people around him. And he and that set have continued to be a real inspiration to be all through. And I also read them, reflected on my fieldwork, but also reflected back, oddly enough, I didn't say this earlier, on my classical studies. I'd loved all that literature. And one of the really good bits of advice I got right at the beginning, when I first went to Somerville, from this rather dry Maud's tutor, was that I should read all my set texts aloud. And I was a very good little girl and thought you always had to do what your tutors told you. And I did. I read a huge number of stuff you had to read. And I did read it all aloud, maybe not very loudly loud, but whenever I had gone through and worked out what this bit of Livy said, or Lucretius, or Aeschylus, I would then go back and read it aloud to myself. And so I had already got a bit of the idea that literature had got a sonic, acoustic aspect to it. And that then kind of gathered itself together with my interest in performance.
And you were going to say something more about EP, but I don't know whether it's at this point you'd like to say the supervision by EP.
Yes, he was my supervisor. And for me, he was a wonderful supervisor. I think it wouldn't have done for everyone, because he basically left me to my own devices, and he just had faith that I would get on with it, which is a bit dangerous, not what supervisors are told they should do now. But what he was so wonderful about was whenever I wrote a chapter, and I was reasonably good at sticking to my own deadlines, after this experience of writing 2 essays a week as an undergraduate, he would always read it within 2 days and come back with comments. Not very big comments. They might be a comment like, do you have evidence for this? For these things that you say? And I would say, oh yes, of course, but then I would go back and think a little bit. But he was always encouraging in his rather dry, slightly shy way. And he gave me total backing about anything I wanted to do. And that was wonderful. And we still continued the visits to the pub with him and Godfrey Leonhardt, particularly, and David Pocock to some extent. He was slightly a hanger-on, but was also very useful and interesting and helpful. And so though I can't especially pin down anything that they particularly said in those pub sessions, they all had a big influence on me.
Did they relax with the beer? I mean, is that the reason why it was so effective? Because being rather shy and withdrawn academics, they could now relax in your presence and banter and explore.
Yes. But I think that's probably right. I hadn't thought about it that way. As I say, as a slightly Ulster puritanical girl, I didn't like the idea of pubs. And at that point, I didn't think I wanted to drink too much. And anyway, I have always disliked beer. And that's a big disadvantage if you're an Oxford-trained anthropologist.
Yeah.
But then I discovered that it was okay to drink cider. So that made life much easier.
What about, there were 1 or 2 other members of that, I don't know if they went to the pub, but Rodney Needham was there then, obviously, wasn't he?
He was there, and he very much didn't go to the pub. I don't mean he never went to the pub, he was sometimes there, but he was very much not a member of that gang. In fact, there was really rather a division down between them at that time. And I was rather on the kind of Leonhardt Pocock side, though later I realised I'd been a bit unfair to Rodney Needham in that, but it was a time of great loyalties. And of course, great loyalty to Oxford as against these useless people in Cambridge or LSE.
Yes. Did you have any dealings with useless people in LSE or Cambridge, like Meyer or any of the Jack Goody or the West Africanists there?
Not really at that time. Before I did field work, I went up to Edinburgh because that's where they did Sierra Leone at that time. And they were actually very helpful with
Little,
contacts.
wasn't it?
Little, yes. Yes. And Michael Banton.
Yeah, oh yes, that's right. So the writing went well, you got some comments, and who were your examiners at the end of it?
My examiners were, who were my examiners? John Beattie. No, I beg your pardon, John Beattie was my B-Lit. Godfrey Leonhardt is the internal. And someone called Jack Berry from SOAS, who was a West Africanist linguist.
How do you spell him? B-E-R?
B-E-R-R-Y, like
yes,
Blackberry.
Yeah.
Jack Berry. And he had actually done one of these typical linguistic little articles about Limba grammar from elicited data, as linguists do, which was very helpful to me before I went out to Sierra Leone, because I felt that, you needed to know about grammar if you were going to learn a language, as I thought. So he was a very appropriate person. He had also written a good thing about West African stories, I think it was called, or West African unwritten literature. It was quite a short thing, but I'd found it very inspiring when I was doing my
That was lucky.
doctorate. Yes, quite.
And he was a good examiner.
Well, they were both very fair in the sense that they read it, clearly had read it, and of course they were very fair in being complimentary about it, Alan.
And said you should publish it.
They said I should publish it, and Godfrey particularly gave me some very good advice when I then later on came on to publish it. The advice I particularly remember was he said that I had rather talked about the storyteller, whereas it'd be much better, as a kind of curate's egg, it would be much better if I took examples of, say, 4 or 5 and talked about them. And of course that was such obvious good advice that nowadays I hope any doctoral student would already have given themselves. But things were a bit more kind of generalised then than I think they are now. But that was very good advice, which actually I've never forgotten ever since.
It must have been a very exciting time in anthropology at Oxford. That was the early 60s, wasn't it, really?
It was. I got my doctorate in 63, so I was doing it from early 62 to 63. Well, it was, but somehow...
Or maybe
I don't mean it wasn't exciting, but and we always had these wonderful Friday seminars where people came and talked. But people were, in a way, doing their own thing. And there were these divisions. And it was, I think, at that time that E.P.'s wife died. And that was, very sad, and there was the problem about his children. So things were a little bit kind of quiet in one sense, even though there was a lot going on.
Were there any of your contemporaries doing PhDs, etc., who you kept in touch with or who became well-known anthropologists? Do you remember any of the co-PhD students?
Most of the people that I did the diploma with didn't go on to do anthropology in Britain. One, Carmelo Lisone.
Oh, yeah, Tolosana.
Yes, Tolosana, I beg his pardon. Went back to Spain and became a big noise in anthropology there. And I have, to some extent, kept in touch with him. There weren't so many of my contemporaries who went on in Britain. Some were, they came from all over the place. That was one of the really nice things. And they went back to where they'd come from. And some didn't go on to do anthropology. But nevertheless, I mean, one very good friend that I'm still very close to didn't go on academically in anthropology, but it influenced her whole life. She's the one who was 70 recently, and I gave letters to Lily to as a present, and she thought it was a wonderful present.
Thank you for that nice plug, which will go onto YouTube shortly. Then there's the moment, which I describe in my students as a sort of postpartum depression delivery. You know, the thesis is done, the viva's done, all those troubles that you put off until the thesis is done suddenly loom over you. What happened then? What did you do?
Well, I was very lucky. I didn't have that because I did my doctorate at Nuffield College, and there I met David Murray, whom I'm still married to, very happily. And we fell in love, we got engaged. He was going out to what was then Southern Rhodesia, having had spent a bit of time in Macfarlane. And he had assumed, like all the rest of us had, that Southern Rhodesia, like the other African colonies, would gradually move towards majority rule. And he was very happy to go and teach at the university there. So he went off in February '63. I stayed to finish my doctorate, which I finished in the summer '63, knowing that he was coming back in September and we were getting married in September. So I had to get it done in time. I really was quite fast, actually. But then went straight out to Southern Rhodesia with him. So I had my new life out there. There was a little bit of postpartum depression because he'd got a job there. I hoped I would, but I hadn't as yet. So the first term I was there without an academic job, though I could still be working on my doctorate that was going to turn into a book, I hoped. But then I got a job there. And of course, your first job teaching and lecturing is very intensive. I had no time to feel depressed, except by the political situation. Because both David and I wanted very much to encourage African students on. We felt we were doing quite a good job in that, while not neglecting the white students. But at that time, Ian Smith had got in unexpectedly, and every step we took forward to help to widen participation, really the government was taking 2 steps back and our students were being taken off into detention. So in the end, after not very, very long there, we decided the only thing really was to leave. That just being there as white, for all we thought we were helping, was actually making things worse, or it might have been. So we went off to Ibadan in Nigeria, which is a breath of fresh air, intellectually and socially and politically, not climate-wise.
And what did you do there? What you were again with the university, or
we were both teaching at the University of Ibadan. Of course, they didn't like it being called anthropology there, so I was a lecturer in sociology. I've never minded that. I think they're the same subject, the good bits of them. And that was really interesting time. It was a first-rate university, I would say. Gradually getting more Africanized. The Vice-Chancellor was African. It was at the time of the Civil War in Nigeria, Biafra.
yes,
So a lot of the Igbo staff and students all departed. So there were difficulties, but it still was a wonderful, intellectually exciting place. I mean, that really was intellectually exciting. And it was so interesting teaching mature African, thoughtful students. Don't mean they were all brilliant students, but it was such a challenge, and some of them were really great, and colleagues, some wonderful colleagues. And it was at the time that Wole Soyinka was writing his plays, and a number of them were being produced on the campus at that time. It was, I won't forget. Also, our 3 daughters were born while we were there. We were there 65 to 69. So altogether, it was quite a full time. It was also, when I was in Southern Rhodesia, as it then was, I'd finished my doctoral thesis as a book that was published as Limber Stories and Storytelling. And then I began, while I was in Salisbury, and continued in Ibadan, the book that became Oral Literature in Africa. So I was very busy with that. And looking back, I'm quite surprised that in those 4 and a bit years, I managed to produce 3 daughters, millions of lectures, as far as I remember, which is quite hard work. And just about the whole manuscript of that, actually quite long and based on a lot of work book. But it was a very exciting, happy time, despite the problems.
Did you get to know then, or I'm sure later you did, Robin Horton?
Oh yes, he was wonderful. And actually Robin and I cooperated on a kind of festschrift for EP called Modes of Thought.
A wonderful book. Yes.
And we began working on that together, though it was then finished after Dave and I came back to Britain. Robin is wonderful. Not an easy person to work with, because he never replies to letters, ever. I think it's almost a principle, or abides by kind of criteria or lengths or anything like that. But I always found, and I don't always agree with him, but I always found him so totally inspiring and a wonderful person.
Very wide-ranging.
Very wide-ranging. And he worked a lot on philosophy, and that was something that I'd also done at Oxford and found, well, some of the Oxford versions were strange, but I had an interest in that. So we had a lot of very interesting discussions. Lovely person he is too.
The other very different kettle of fish, as he would say, was G.I. Jones. Did you know G.I. Jones at all?
I didn't really know him. Of course I met him and know of him, but I didn't come across him directly or interact with him.
Because he worked on Ebo and Ebo
yes, I don't
art.
think he wasn't,
No.
I was never in the same place as him in a sustained way.
So after this 4 packed years, 3 daughters, 2 books, thousands of lectures, you came back to England.
Yes, yes. I do want to talk about that, but can I just say quickly about the oral literature in Africa book?
Yeah, yes,
That the reason I wrote it was that when I was doing my doctorate, I came across a thing which said that Wilfred Whiteley, who was a wonderful anthropologist, linguist, as SOAS, and had very much encouraged me on a lot of things, was going to produce a book called African Prose. And I thought, my goodness, that's just the book I need, because what I need to do is to put in context my little limber thing into a wider thing. But then I discovered that actually it was going to be an anthology of written prose extracts, and very good too, but not what I wanted. But from that I realized that people might want a book that was like that. And so and EP very much encouraged me, decided I would do a kind of overview of what was known or not known, what the debates were in what might be called, arguably, controversially, oral literature in Africa. And though I'd always sworn I would never write a book with Africa in the title, because these generalizations are so awful, nevertheless, people found it interesting to see just what, in fact, a lot more was known than had been realized just gathering it up.
What is the main theme of the book? I mean, you've been hesitant about the word oral and the word literature, but it was exploring that. Tell us what it was exploring.
Well, I thought of it as more an empirical book without any theory in it. Though looking back, of course, it was implicit. But I think the message was, there are literary forms in Africa, and they've been studied lots, but people just don't recognize that. But they've also been studied in a way which sometimes misconceives them, because it hasn't been realized how important performance, again, is, or how important the oral in the sense of the sonic performative aspects are, and that the difference between written and oral is much more on a sliding scale than this absolute divide that has still so often been posited. And it was also very much reacting against narrow functionalist analyses in which you were looking to see how stories supported the status quo or passed on the morals or socialize the children, or how it was all part of oral tradition and upholding the tribe and the communal culture. And I wanted to put it on the same sort of, within the same framework as I'd been used to for written literature, that there's creativity, individuality, change, interaction, livingness. So in a way, those were the sort of, it was more that I was reacting against things rather than trying to put forward consciously a different viewpoint. Though, in fact, looking back, I see I was.
Very interesting. Right, well, shall we come back to England then?
Yes, and we had to decide
where you were going to
where
go.
we were going to go. And though both David and I had been at Oxford, we'd been in a developing ex-colonial situation with mature students, a lot of, older, in practice sometimes part-time. And we just didn't want to go back to an established elite place. So we were very fortunate that it was just the time the Open University was founded in 1969. And we thought that's just the sort of thing that we would like to be part of. And so David was very quickly appointed, we applied, both applied, David was very quickly appointed as to the chair of government, which was a big up for him. He wanted government and politics. They were not so sure about me, but they realised they weren't going to get him without me, because they weren't going to have anthropology, but they were going to have sociology, but in an interdisciplinary kind of framework. So they first of all said, well, I could come for a year to see if I was up to anything. But then, in fact, I stayed until I retired, apart from 3 years abroad for a while. And we were really glad we'd come. And it was extremely challenging, because how do you teach students at a distance when all our experience was lectures and tutorials and face-to-face and the implicit, unstated that just kind of seeps through in student culture.
Can't take them into the lamb and flag, for instance.
Exactly. So it made us think a lot about what is scholarship, what is learning, what do students get out of it, rather than just what do we as wonderful academics get out of it. So though, in a way, I didn't do anthropology as such under that heading, I learned a huge amount about scholarship and learning, and why would one want to do a degree, but also managed to smuggle anthropology in under lots of different guises into a huge lot of interdisciplinary courses, and I didn't actually care what the label was.
And you did some more fieldwork in England after that?
Yes.
Hidden musicians?
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Yes. I mean, I had several reasons for that. One was, I mean, of course, I felt I should be going back to the Limber. But A, I had children, and I wasn't going to try dragging them to the field, or David. I know some people make different decisions. I wasn't. But also, I was more and more aware that the Limber were just one group of what were called 13 different tribes, linguistic units, as divided up by the colonial authorities, in a small country the size of Ireland. And the Limber lived in northern Sierra Leone, where there were, forgotten now, 5-6 different languages that partly linguistically merged into each other. And even the ones that didn't, there was a huge amount of culture that went right across the whole of the north of Sierra Leone. The secret societies, for example, their kind of ranks were cross-tribal. And I was more and more worried about this whole concept of tribe that seemed so obvious in the 1960s. And realised if I was going to do anything proper, I would have to learn about 5 different languages and go back and look at that. And I balked at that. But also, well, Britain was quite interesting too. We actually joined the Open University in 1969. Then in 1975 to 1978, we went off and we worked in Fiji, the University of the South Pacific in Fiji for 3 years. And I got very interested in the urban music, the threefold traditions of Fijian, Indian, lots of Indians there, and European. And I did a bit of a study of that, which partly made me realise that, well, urban music might be interesting anyway. And the whole lot of things came together that led into my fieldwork on urban music when I got back. One of them, and this is a bit personal and silly, we travelled back by land as far as we could, across the Trans-Siberian Express, and all the way through I was looking out of the window thinking, as an anthropologist and a person, I wonder what they do in that village, I wonder what they think about, I wonder what they're like. And for the first time in my life, when I got to the English Channel, I went on looking out of the train window and thought, well, England, what do they do?
That's very nice.
And I had been a member of a local amateur choir in Milton Keynes already, came back to it again. And I was aware how much even a bad amateur, because I'm a really bad singer, Alan, really bad, how much even a bad singer could get out of it, and how important this weekly ritual was, and the performances, well, how much it meant. And I wondered, among many other things, how other people felt about that, how it came to be like that. And also, how did amateur music get supported? What were all the networks and the ramifications? And so that then led into my study called The Hidden Musicians, which is about amateur music making across the different types of music. I mean, jazz and rock and pop and classical, which I realised was only one. I never thought before, it's only one. It's not the natural way of doing music. And I found that a very difficult study to do. Urban, as Peter Riviere said to me, how can you do that? I'm used to the field situation where you lie in your hammock and you see all your informants within sight. So there's a whole series of different kind of methods, including documentary. Newspapers, very good source. The ads, not the articles so much. And I had this huge amount of material. It was really hard work. But it's still, I was just thinking, you know, authors have their favourite books, really, don't you?
Oh, yes.
Yes, and that is one of my favourite ones because I learned so much from about it, and it was about real people, not, I mean, some of my other books have been a bit comparative and theoretical, had more influence perhaps, but that and the limber stories and storytelling, that was really people where I learned something and had something, hopefully, to offer.
That's very nice. We're just getting towards the end in terms of tape and time. Perhaps what would be nice, I mean, you might have one or two things you want to say. We've touched on one or two people you've known professionally in your career, EP and so on. Are there any other anthropologists who have influenced, or thinkers who have influenced you a lot and you'd like to say something about?
Well, when I went to Salisbury, southern Rhodesia, I went very much with the Oxford idea that these are Manchester people, they don't know anything about anything. But Mitchell there, Clyde Mitchell, was very much into the kind of networking. And I hadn't thought before, really, about the networking and the interactionist side. So that was a real eye-opener to me, and putting together different viewpoints. But otherwise, it's, well, many people. John Blacking, Queen's University, with his wide and very human view and his work on music has always been a great inspiration. But otherwise, very much some of the American writers. I mean, Howard Becker, who you would probably regard as a sociologist, but his whole interactionist human thing. And then particularly these linguistic anthropologists, Dick Bauman, Joel Scherzer, Del Himes, Charles Briggs. They have been they're so wise, they're always 6 jumps ahead of me.
How do you spell Scherzer?
S-H-E-R-Z-E-R. He was at the University of Austin in Texas for a long time.
Yeah.
And in Britain, Peter Burke I worked a lot with, because we did a Cambridge series called Oral Literate Cultures together. And he's great, wonderful.
Wonderful polymath.
I do have to say that I found Alan Macfarlane's work very, very inspiring.
That's very sweet. Another plug on YouTube. Great. Thank you. This was on English individualism or something like that.
Yes, but also the breadth. And that's something I value, not keeping within traditional disciplinary boundaries. I think the interdisciplinary and working at the margins, which is always difficult, is where the new creative work comes.
And one thing that I'm always interested in is about creativity and method. Do you enjoy writing, and do you have any tips for viewers about how to think creatively?
I enjoy writing in an agonized way. You'd think you would get better at it, having written quite a lot of books, but I seem to get worse and worse. I think really, any advice is just keep at it. Even when it's rotten, keep at it, and then you can always go back and change it.
Keep writing.
Keep writing, yes.
Well, I've asked my questions particularly, but are there any other things that you would like to add or say about your life? And
well, I was just thinking about it, and I think maybe two themes. One is this interdisciplinary working at the margins, I've just said. The other is, I think I've always been interested in the hidden, the invisible, that is not thought to exist by conventional wisdom, whether it's the amateur musicians or the oral storytellers or the scholars outside the universities that I've just done a thing on, or at one point the informal economy. I think all those things, anthropologists, it's almost their duty to look at, but certainly it's been my delight to look at.
Well, that delight is a nice word to end on, so thank you very much indeed, Ruth. That was lovely.